Hi, I'm Sarah Griffith Lund, and I'm a minister in the United Church of Christ and the Disciples of Christ. In 2014, Chalice Press published my book, Blessed Are the Crazy, Breaking the Silence About Mental Illness, Family, and Church. It has been a calling of mine to share with congregations and people of faith through the UCC Mental Health Network how breaking the silence, how sharing our personal stories about how our lives have been impacted by mental illness is a way we can bring hope and healing. So thank you for watching this presentation. I pray that it brings you hope as you share this message of healing with your loved ones. Well, it's good to be here together as fellow sojourners in life, following the way that has been laid out, not always the way we would choose to go. And so I wanted to begin with a word of hope. In the scriptures, I turn to this psalm often, and I did in my ministry, Psalm 23, and so to begin with a word of hope, let us hear the testimony in the scriptures. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths for His name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley, I fear no evil. For You are with me. Your rod and Your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I begin with a word of hope because hope is a very delicate thing. And when we are walking through the valleys of the shadow of mental illness, it can be so easy to lose hope. So we begin with this reminder of God's presence with us, even in that valley of the shadows. I remember Felix today. And I'm so grateful to this congregation for honoring his life through dedicating your congregation to this ministry of mental health and mental wellness. And I remember my father today, who died 10 years ago from mental illness. And I wonder, who are you remembering today? Who are you thinking about today? We also remember the founder of the Semicolon Project, Amy. We remember and we hold on to hope. I was in a church right after burying my father, and I was with other young clergywomen. We were in the crypt of this cathedral in Washington, D.C., and just the day before, I was in rural Missouri on a hilltop with the wind blowing my black robe as we prayed and buried my father under the ground. It was a small group of us, my mother, my 3 brothers, and my sister. We stood around the open graveside, my father's body cremated in a box. It was as heavy as a bowling ball. He was a big man. And as we placed his body in the ground, we prayed the Our Father. And leading my siblings and my mother and I in this prayer of Our Father who art in heaven, my voice choked. Because there we were, together. And the last time we had all been together like that, my father was still alive. It was just 6 months before his death. It was my wedding day. You don't forget your wedding day. And this was incredible because on my wedding day, my father appeared out of nowhere. We hadn't talked to him for at least a year. He was so angry with us because it was the only way we knew how to get him help. We had him hospitalized against his will. He was furious we had done that to him. He believed that was the ultimate betrayal, but we thought it was the only way to save his life. You see, he lived with mental illness, and it manifested itself in a very, very strong way when I was just a baby. So the whole time I knew my father, he had this severe and chronic mental illness, and one of the symptoms was anosognosia. Now that's a word I just learned, and it helps explain everything. Anosognosia is what we call the symptom when the person who has the mental illness, one of the symptoms is a lack of insight, a lack of self-awareness. Part of the disease in their brain makes it so that they cannot tell that they're sick. So that if you reflect to someone, "Are you feeling well? I'm concerned about you. I think you might need to see a doctor," there is an alternate reality in that person's mind. And so for the 2 decades, we tried to encourage my father to get medical treatment, to get medications. He was hearing voices. He was having delusions. He thought he was being followed, paranoia. He had manic and depression the whole time. We thought he was stubborn. We thought he didn't love us. But the whole time, his illness prevented him from getting the very help that would save his life. So as a little girl, I thought my father didn't love me, because if my father loved me, he would get help. And now I know he did love me. But his brain did not allow him to be in relationship with me the way that a little girl needs her father to be in relationship with her. And it was a brain disease. It was a brain disease. So today we're talking about brain diseases and mental illness, and I'm sharing some of my stories because I have been so ashamed of this in my life that I've kept it a secret. I'm an ordained minister. I've served congregations. I've served as a conference minister staff person. And the whole time growing up in the church, I felt that this was a shameful secret. Because my father's severe mental illness, his anosognosia that didn't permit him to know that he needed help, he went from being a successful animal doctor on the school board, father of 5 children, to a person who was homeless, living in squatted properties, being cared for by compassionate strangers and by churches who had outreach ministries to people who were homeless and hungry. And all this time, while he was living on the streets in Southern California and Los Angeles, he had 5 children in college studying to be medical doctors, scientists, and pastors. He had an ex-wife who was an elementary school teacher. He had family who loved him, but his illness did not make it possible for us to help him. And that's what's so hard to understand. So many people who are living on the streets, who end up in jail, are people with mental illnesses, with mood disorders and brain disorders, with invisible disabilities. And what do we say to people? How do we generalize that kind of population? We tend to blame them, say, well, something's wrong with them, they're not working hard enough, they're lazy, they deserve whatever it is that's going on. very judgmental. And unfortunately, because of lack of education, sometimes the church participates in that kind of judgment. And even though we do charity and we have handouts to people who are poor and in jail and who have mental illness, that's not the same as being in relationship to people who have disabilities, who have mental illness. And it can be very challenging to be in relationship with people, especially when their brain diseases and mental illnesses are untreated. It was so hard as a little girl to have a relationship with my father when all he wanted to talk about was Lyndon LaRouche and communist plots and how my mother didn't love men anymore and she loved women now and that's why she wasn't with him, and how we should all come and live with him in his squatted apartment. And that it was Satan who was tearing the family apart. This is what my father believed with his whole heart. And he would cry on the phone with me, "Why don't you understand, Sarah? Why don't you believe me?" And so while I grew alienated from him, he grew more and more alienated from his family and from society, trapped in his own world that was so detached from reality because of his brain disorder. Now, when we left my dad, my mom said, this is not a safe situation anymore. Because of his voices that he heard and his delusions, he believed that Satan was involved in tearing the family apart. In his mind, the way he could describe what was happening was not that he had a brain disorder, but that Satan was doing something. He could tell something was wrong, but the anosognosia didn't allow him to see clearly. It was his own brain betraying him. So he, like many other people with brain diseases, if they have a religious background, sometimes they look to the scriptures. And in scriptures, sometimes there's references to the devil and to Satan who tempt people. And so for my father, that's the only way how he could explain why his family was leaving him and why things were falling apart. So then you have children who are being told by their father that the devil is destroying the family. My father's belief that the devil was destroying the family led him to be a violent person because he thought he was fighting the devil. Because his mental illness did not allow him to know that it was his own brain and the brain disease. He believed that my teenage brother at the time was involved with Satan worship. His thinking was altered. And so when my brother was skateboarding and listening to punk music, to my father, those were signs of the devil. And so after school one day, he decided he would win that battle. And he confiscated all of my brother's skateboards. He had 3 of them. He was a serious skateboarder. He had the mohawk to go with it. And so there was this great battle in our home. And determined to defeat Satan, my father collected the skateboards. And we're witnessing this as children. Running around the home, my father taking the skateboards to his truck. He was going to get rid of this once and for all. And my brother chasing my father out the door and into the truck, grabbing the skateboards out of the truck. And my father, desperate to defeat the devil, reversing the truck. And my brother falling out the truck window and hitting his head on the cement driveway. And my father rolling over my brother's body and going to the dump because my dad was going to defeat the devil. This is the anosognosia, the inability to know that the voices in your head are not Satan, but it's your brain that has a disease. And so we called 911. My mom was still at work. It was the 5 of us kids. What happens sometimes in families is we don't talk about these things. And so we never discussed what had happened until a couple of years ago. I said, "Mom, do you remember when that happened?" And I said, "Mom, what do you remember about that?" And she said, "Well, I remembered being at the hospital with your brother, and the police showed up. And the police asked me if we wanted to press charges against your father." And do you know what my mother said to the police officer? Well, she first looked to her son, my brother, in the hospital bed and said, "What do you think we should do?" And he said, "No." So my mother said to the officer, "No, we will not press charges." And I share that story because it is very common in families with complex dynamics, including mental illness, where there is some form of violence. It's very hard to break that cycle of violence. It takes about an average of 7 different times. And so I commend my mother for her courage. For her, that was the last straw. She knew that we were in danger. It's not that my father wanted to hurt us. He was hearing voices. And so we left. We left my father. And our family never reunited because of this anosognosia. Part of his bipolar disorder prevented him from agreeing to get treatment. So when I was getting married, I wanted to be a good daughter and honor my father and mother and at least invite my father to my wedding. So I sent the wedding invitation to the last address we had. He had been staying with a friend. And he shows up at the wedding. We hadn't seen him for over a year. And he is wearing shoes that are falling apart, clothes that he had been sleeping in for days. And he was there for my wedding. I had not planned for my father to walk me down the aisle. It wasn't the kind of relationship we had. I'd wanted my brother Scott, the one who had been run over, to walk me down the aisle. You see, my brother Scott, he had his own psychotic break just a few years after that incident with our dad. And what is different when there's generations of mental illness and when you know some of the warning signs and symptoms, when you can get treatment, my brother got help right away. He was hospitalized in high school. And from then to this very day, he's been in recovery from a dual diagnosis. In and out of hospital several times. One of his symptoms is severe suicidal ideation. He says, every hour I think about ways to stop the pain. Even though he's had electroconvulsive therapy, medications, counseling, support groups, still the brain disease is so severe that every hour, when he's doing well, every hour he thinks about ways to stop the pain. In his recovery, he was able to go on to college, full scholarships, marry his high school sweetheart, all with this diagnosis of bipolar, go on to get a PhD in biochemistry, studying protein crystallography, published in a journal of science. And the whole time we knew it was his support system that was allowing him to be so successful in life. He had an amazing wife. And we would always say, thank God for her. Thank God for her, because without her, we think that he would be dead. But you know what we didn't say? How can we help you? How can we support you? What do you need from us? How are you doing? We never said that to his wife. They had wanted to have children. My brother was so afraid. This bipolar disorder, it tends to run in families. Scientists think it's genetic. My brother was fearful that if they had a child together, they would pass on this disorder. She wanted to have a baby. She became a child psychologist. They both became professors, and she wanted that baby. They were not getting along, and so they separated, and my brother came to stay with me. And she called me. She said, "I'm glad he's with you now because after I'm done talking to you, I'm going to call him and ask for a divorce." She had tried, and she had very little support in their marriage from anyone. We never talked about it. We never asked how we could support them in their marriage. Well, after she hung up the phone with me, I knew what I needed to do to make sure my brother was safe. What do you do when you live with somebody who has suicidal ideation? You make sure there are no firearms in the house. Gun safety is critical. Very important when we're talking about mental illness. Knives, pills. You have to make the home a safe environment for someone who is vulnerable. Well, that divorce really was so hard on my brother, as you can imagine. And once that divorce happened, he really has had a very difficult time recovering emotionally from that. He is on full disability now because of his mental illness. And he tells a story about when he was doing the paperwork to be qualified for disability benefits. And that's a very rigorous process. There's a lot of paperwork. Many people have to apply several times. But given his case record and his history of hospitalizations and medications, he applied one time and got in his first time. His illness and disability was so serious and severe. But the thing about mental illness, many people call it an invisible disease. So that when he was doing his final paperwork, the gentleman helping him happened to be in a wheelchair. And the gentleman said, "Look, I got it easy compared to you. People look at me and they can see I have a disability. When people look at you, they can't tell." And my brother lives with that every day, even from doctors who look at him and say, "You look like you should be working." And they don't understand that with his severe bipolar disorder, he's not feeling capable of doing that, of working a job, but because of the way he looks, people make assumptions. In the churches, we make assumptions about people based on the way that we look. And we also treat people differently based on what disability or diseases they have. It's a hard reality to admit, but it's true. How do we respond to church members when they are hospitalized for heart disease? Or when they're going through chemotherapy? What supports do we have in place generally? There's meals prepared. You might be visited by Stephen's minister or by the pastor. How often are pastors going to visit psychiatric hospitals, jails or prisons or death row? Mental illness, mental disease is often called the non-casserole disease. It's the non-casserole disease. It's the disease that we don't think to make a casserole for that person coming out of the psychiatric hospital or inpatient, or for the families. I have friends who are clergy who live with mental health challenges. I myself have a therapist to make sure that the spectrum of my mental wellness stays in a good place. It's good for all of us to have support, to see counselors, spiritual directors, therapists. Have you had a checkup from the neck up? Patrick Kennedy, who's a great advocate and educator for mental wellness, he talks about that. Get a checkup from the neck up. It's part of your annual exam. So my clergy friends who have mental health challenges, there's a lot of stigma for the general population and so much more for the clergy. And that is why I have kept silent about the generations of mental illness in my family because I was afraid if people knew my story, then people might judge me or think that I was unfit to be a pastor. And especially with my dad and his delusions and hearing voices and growing up afraid of my father, part of a safety approach, my mother told us children to not tell anyone about what was happening. She was concerned for our safety. But as a child, I really took that to heart, to not tell anyone. And so from a very young age, I internalized all of the struggles, anxieties, all the challenges, so that when this was going on, I didn't tell a single soul. And what happens to you when you stuff everything inside? Children will often have chronic stomach aches, and they can't tell really what's wrong. Oftentimes there's an emotional problem in the home. Chronic stomach aches or bedwetting. That's what happened to me, bedwetting at age 9 and 10 because of the stress in the home. But the secrecy is very dangerous. And what I want to encourage us to do in any community that we are in is to begin making the invitation for people to share their stories so that we don't have to live with our secrets that keep us isolated from one another. That brain disease is no different than heart disease. That it is a part of our physical body and there is no shame in having an illness. And that as a faith community, we are people who can offer support, compassion, inclusion, and care for people and their families as they're struggling. Part of the journey to be a pastor is to go through psychological testing and evaluations to ensure that our leaders of our churches are healthy and can be trusted and use their authority without violating that power. And so I remember in my conversations with the psychologist in my exam for ordination, them asking me a lot of questions about my family history. You fill out little bubbles on a page. And when I met with the person to get the results of my exam, he said a couple of strange things to me. The first one he said was, "Do you have a boyfriend?" And I thought, "No." He said, "Well, I have a son your age." Very professional. Yes. And then the second thing he said to me is, "Sarah, you've lived a charmed life." A charmed life. You know, this was a person who was to take in my family history, talk about family systems and how it might impact me. And I share that to say that we become really good at hiding behind a mask and keeping secrets for fear of judgment and rejection, especially in the church, especially for clergy who are expected to be at a level of perfection that is not humanly possible. When my father died, I told the moderator of the church that I was going to miss Sunday to go for my dad's funeral. And she was shocked, really, because my father was only 64 years old. And she said, "Well, Sarah, he was so young." And the church gave me all kinds of beautiful Hallmark cards, condolence cards about a daughter and father and that special relationship. And I started to feel really angry and disappointed in myself because no one in the church knew. They did not know at all about my father's lifelong struggle with mental illness and how it impacted me. And I realized that as a religious leader, as a pastor, that I was not integrated. And that it was difficult to be an honest person with integrity when there were so many parts of my identity that were fragmented and hidden away. And that part of my own healing was starting to share and tell people the truth. the truth about my life. And what I realized is that so many of us here feel like we don't have permission to tell the truth about our lives. Does anybody else feel that way? That there are different aspects of our identity, that we have been given messages that aren't appropriate or don't fit in or aren't the way it's supposed to be. And so if you feel like there's anything slightly different or not perfect about yourself, then we kind of hide and cover it up. And that's part of the Christian culture that I really want to challenge us to push back against. This idea of hiding and covering up and wearing a mask. So sharing my story is sharing about the valleys and the shadows of mental illness. About talking about things that we are told to be ashamed of. But there is no shame in being sick and having an illness, and taking medications and seeing a doctor. And people need support. They need prayer and also medications and therapists. It's a holistic approach to healing. There is a place for prayer, integrated with other forms of support. My father's sister also struggles with untreated mental illnesses. And part of how that manifested in her life was in her parenting. So that growing up, we noticed there were things that she did to our cousins that we thought were really strange. And we explained it away as being part of country folk. We were city folk. They were country folks. Maybe they do things different in the country. But in truth, looking back, we saw signs of abuse that we decided to look the other way. And that's part of the silencing and the shame that puts children at risk. And what happened was this particular cousin had mental illness as a child, and it wasn't treated. And so as a young person, he acted out, stealing things, bothering his sister. And eventually, he would start getting arrested and in jail. So instead of seeing somebody who needed help and a doctor, we saw someone who was a bad person, somebody who we should avoid and stay away from. And so one day, my cousin, Paul, he shows up at our home and he says, I just got out of jail. Can I have $20 to drive back to the farm? And my mom and I were there, and she gave him $20. We didn't really want him around. And so he went back to the farm. And then the next day, he was arrested for murder. We just couldn't believe it. How could that have happened? A Christian woman, a mother, a wife, and she was dead. And all the evidence was there on my cousin's clothing. A psychotic episode. Well, he was charged with murder in the state of Missouri. And he came from very little means, no money, pro bono attorneys. He had a whole history of mental illness, of abuse, and none of that mattered to the jury, who sentenced him to death at age 20. So I was a senior in high school when my cousin was sentenced to death. My dad was homeless. My brother in and out of psychiatric hospitals. And all of this for me was too much. But I knew how to wear a mask, and I knew how to keep secrets, so that's what I did. Until in college, I heard Sister Helen Prejean, the incredible woman of God who goes to death row and ministers to people there. She says that that's where she meets Christ, on death row. And she came and talked to our campus, and I remembered that my cousin was on death row. I had suppressed that so deeply that I literally had forgotten I had a cousin on death row. So we started writing to each other. The thing is, when I was writing him, he would write me back. And I would write him and say, I'm thinking about going to seminary. I think God's calling me to be a minister. And Paul, he would write back and he said, Sarah, I think God's calling me to be a minister too. I've been talking to the chaplain. I've been reading my Bible. Here's a poem I wrote about Jesus. I prayed for him and he prayed for me. You see, on death row, he was the chosen one. And if you know anything about prison culture, you know what I'm talking about. He was the one that got picked on and abused by the other inmates. And because of that, he decided to choose solitary confinement as a way to keep safe for 10 years on death row. I went to seminary, and he went to the execution chambers. My last semester in seminary, he wrote a letter saying his execution was going to be in 30 days. Would I come see him? Would I be his spiritual advisor? I was entering into finals week. I was too busy to do that. Well, I asked my dean what I should do. I said to him, look, you don't know this. I've never told anybody, but my cousin is on death row, and his execution is during finals week. What should I do? What do you think the dean said? The dean of the seminary, training people to be pastors, to be followers of Jesus. He said, go to death row because there is holy ground. And I was so angry because I thought that was my way out. I didn't want to go to death row. My brother Scott, he didn't want to go to death row. My two other siblings, who were by this time doctors, they came with me, the three of us, 2 doctors and a minister, going to Missouri's death row. And what I want to share briefly about that experience is that my cousin had mental illness very severely. And do you know where he got treatment for his mental illness? On death row. That was the only place he ever got help. On death row. He was in total denial of his execution. We were laughing, telling stories, talking about Grandpa and riding the horses. And then the nurse says, it's time to get ready. And I'll never forget the other things she said. She said, Paul, I have some medication for you. Medication to help your anxiety. You might be feeling anxious. And he said no. You know what Paul wanted? He wanted to live. And he wanted chocolate cake, which they didn't have. So my last words to Paul, what do you say? I love you, Paul. God loves you too. And my brother made these huge buttons. It was a button of a childhood picture of Paul. Said God's child on it. We wanted everyone on death row to know that Paul was a child of God. He was a child. these shameful secrets that we have about our families, about American society, about our criminal justice system that abuses people with disabilities and diseases. This is something that we're called to testify to. And as Christians, we're called to be witnesses to the radical love of God in Christ Jesus and the hope that we can have in redemption. You see, Paul was a child of God. And when I saw him executed that night, I felt part of God slip away from me. Because God was executed. As Christians, we have a powerful calling to be the face and hands of God, even on death row, even in the psychiatric hospital, even on the streets, with men and women and children who are fathers and mothers, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters who are suffering from untreated, undiagnosed brain diseases. I want to end with a couple of quotes from my book. When I wrote this book, I really felt God calling me to break the silence. And so the book came out a couple of years ago, and I've been back to my home church several times. And there's this really nice couple I always babysat for all through middle school. Every Wednesday night they had Bible study, and I watched their daughter, who was about 8 years old. And they read this book, and when I saw them, they came up to me the first time after they had read it, and they were crying. And they said, "Sarah, we had no idea. We had no idea what you were going through." They said, "If we had known." And so it is life-saving to break the silence, to let people know really what's going on so that we can be Christ to one another. Here is Psalm 23, a word of hope, with a few words changed, inspired by my journey with mental illness. Jesus is my light and gives me all that my spirit needs to carry on. God invites me to trust in divine love so that when the waters run thick with crazy blood, my soul is restored. God leads me down paths of giving my testimony for the sake of healing. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of mental illness, I will fear no evil. For God is with me, and God's Spirit is with me, and God comforts me, and God prepares a table before me in the presence of mental illness. God makes sure there is an abundance, enough for everyone. So surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and we will be blessed in God's healing light and love forever. Through the valleys of the shadows of mental illness, we hold on to hope. And we hold on to one another. Thanks be to God. Thanks be to God. I invite you to take a moment to take a deep breath, breathing in and breathing out. Breathing in and breathing out, the breath of God. turn to someone next to you and share one thing that you've heard from my speaking that you want to know more about or go back to. Just one thing that stood out for you that you would like to think more about. We'll just take a moment to turn to a neighbor.